Today's daf we're going to be learning is Yevamot daf Pevav. Today's daf is sponsored by Dan Nadel in loving memory of his mother, Rhoda Nadel, Zisa Risa Bat Aliyah Kohen, on her 25th year at site. We're going to get started. We'll review quickly the Mishna that we saw in yesterday's daf. We saw it was about there are basically three sections to this Mishnah. We have the first section, which is about Yisrael Mu'ureset the Kohen. We have a Yisrael woman engaged, betrothed to a Kohen, or in some other situation, Shemeret Yabam, or pregnant with his child, even though he's dead, where she has some loose connection to him, that already means she can't eat truma. It doesn't give her rights. On the other hand, if she were in that same relationship and she was a bat kohen with the Yisrael, it's enough of a connection to preclude her from eating truma. Same thing with a woman betrothed to a levi, or a bat levi betrothed to, or any of those situations with a Yisrael. Okay, so those are the first two cases. Those are very clear. The last case was a little bit unclear, which was if you have a bat kohen with a levi, or a bat levi with a kohen, you end up with either of those situations where one's a levi and one's a kohen, then also they can't eat truma or maaser, and that's a little bit strange because we'll see today a big basic question: are kohanim leviim also? Aren't they from Shevet Levi? In flashback this week, there's a whole article about Leviim that Shuli Mishkan wrote, so you can read up about Leviim and all sorts of interesting things. Anyway, we're going to have to deal with that. So the first question the Gemara has is, wait a minute. This Mishnah assumes that maaser is like truma, which means no non-levi can eat maaser. Again, let's just go through basics. You get produce. You're a regular Yisrael person. You give 1/50th or 1/40th, 1/60th, depending on how generous or stingy you want to be, to the kohen. After you separate that, you take a tenth, you give it to the levi. That's called maaser rishon. The levi, by the way, has to take truma. We're going to talk about this later, from his maaser. He gets a tenth. He has to give a tenth of that to the kohen. Then you give, after you've taken the maaser for the levi, you then take another maaser, depending on the years, either maaser sheni, which you bring to Jerusalem and eat there, or maaser ani, which you give to the poor. So we're going to talk about all these terms today, so I want to make sure they're clear before we move on. So now comes the Gemara and says, wait a minute. Ezra, the woman who's married or who's betrothed to a levi is considered a non-levi, right? So she's a zara. She's considered like a stranger, like a zar can't eat truma. She also can't eat maaser. Zara milo achla b'maaser. Do we ever say a non-levi can't eat maaser? It doesn't have sanctity like truma that it's only for the kohen. Yes, of course, it's to be given to the levi, but it doesn't mean if you're a guest at a levi's house, you can eat their maaser. If you're a guest at a kohen's house, you can't eat truma. Whoever said you can't eat maaser? So I'm Rav Nachman, Amar Shmuel, Hamane, Rabbi Meir here. Our Mishnah must be Rabbi Meir. Okay, who's Rabbi Meir? Well, Da'amal, and that's, we know who Rabbi Meir is, but what opinion does he hold? Da'amal, maaser rishon asur l'zarim. He holds that maaser rishon is forbidden to non-levites. Now we're going to, not exactly, they're going to quote something he says, which isn't exactly the same thing, but the assumption is that that's really what he means. It says in a braita, truma lekohen, maaser rishon levi, derive Rabbi Meir. Truma goes to the kohen, maaser rishon goes to the levi. This is what Rabbi Meir says. Okay, that means right now. Why I say this, you can see it's not exactly that he's saying you can't, but it sounds like he's saying truma goes specifically to the kohen, maaser rishon goes specifically to the levi, and you can't mix them up at all. Maaser is only for leviim; it's for nobody else. Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria mitiro lekohen. He permits the maaser rishon to be given to a kohen. So mitiro michlal v'ichaman asar. Wait a minute. He permits maaser rishon to a kohen. Wait a minute. If it says he permits, it sounds like somebody forbids. Does anyone forbid maaser rishon to a kohen? The kohen can eat truma and presumably can eat maaser because the kohen is also part of the tribe of Levi. Ela ema, what he means to say is no afla kohen. You can even give it to a kohen, meaning if you're the Yisrael and you're dividing up your maaser, you can decide to give your maaser to a levi if you want. You can decide to give it to a kohen. Nobody thinks that a kohen is prohibited to eat maaser, but they do think that you might not be able to give it to, and as Rabbi Meir seems to say, you give it only to a levi. The kohen gets truma, and the levi gets the maaser. Can't give the maaser to a kohen, where Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria says you can give the maaser to a kohen. I want to point out something interesting. Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria was a kohen. So it's interesting that he, and keep this in mind when we see a story about him later, So it's interesting that he specifically thinks, oh yeah, I'm a kohen, you can give me maaser, okay? So it's just interesting, and we're going to see later. I want to remind you something else about Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria. In the famous story when Rabban Gamliel gets kicked out of being the head of the Beit Midrash, and they bring in Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria, the reason he gets chosen in the end, if you remember, was because he had zchut avod, okay? He actually is descended from Ezra, and which is important for our story, we'll see later. And he was wealthy, if you remember, which was just good in terms of being a leader, right? To be able to communicate with other rulers and stuff. He was wealthy, which is interesting in terms of some story we're going to see later. And we also know now that he was a kohen. So my time of Rabbi Meir. Now, even though Rabbi Meir didn't really say Azar can't eat maaser, we're going to see when they explain his reason that it's clear he holds Azar can't eat maaser. My time of Rabbi Meir, Amar Rav Akiva derive Mishmei de Gemara. So Rav Akiva, the son of Rabba, explains Rabbi Meir's position in the name of Gemara. What does it mean, Gemara? It doesn't mean Gemara. It means that it means tradition. Okay. Ki et maaser b'nei Yisrael asher yarimu laHashem truma. Okay, the maaser b'nei Yisrael that you will yarimu. Yarimu is from the language of truma. Okay, that you will raise, but it means truma. Okay, so now yarimu laHashem truma. It says truma in that pasuk. So now we see there's maaser and there's truma mentioned together, even though the top subject is maaser. So ma truma asura lezarim, af maaser rishon asur lezarim. Just like, what do we learn from this hekesh? Comes Rabbi Meir, or the way they explain Rabbi Meir, and he says, just like truma is forbidden to non-kohanim, likewise maaser is forbidden to non-levites. Okay, and there you see his opinion. So then they say, wait a minute, if you're going to make a hekesh, where you say two things are juxtaposed in the verse, we're going to learn from one to the other. Then take it even farther. Why don't you say that? You're liable to get death by the hands of God, and you have to pay an extra fifth if you're a non-kohen who eats it. So, af maaser, you're going to say the same thing. You're going to say, right? Nobody says that yes, you might say, Rabbi Meir at least holds, a non-levite can't eat truma, can't eat maaser. But nobody thinks he's liable to the death penalty for eating it, or he's going to have to add an extra fifth if he eats it and, return that value to a levi and add a fifth. Nobody thinks that. So why not? A special pasuk there, which limits. Special pasukim by truma say these things are only by truma. This is going to be familiar. We had drashot like this with the arel and all that, and Korban Pesach, we learned about it. Amar kra umetu bo ki yechalaluhu. They're going to die on account of this, meaning this reliable death penalty, but not for maaser. And yasaf chamishato alav. You add a fifth to it, meaning just to this you add a fifth, not to anything else. Bo velo b'maaser, alav velo maaser. Okay, so the bo excludes maaser, the alav excludes maaser, right? Each one from either mita or chomesh. Rabana. Okay, now, so far, just to review, we've established Rabbi Meir is the author of our Mishna, because our Mishna assumes that a non-levi can't eat maaser. And we just showed that he proved it from a hekesh in the pasuk, because it says truma and maaser in the same pasuk when it's really talking about maaser, calls it truma. We learn certain laws of truma are applicable to it as well. Now we have to deal with the rabbis. Rabbanan who disagree with him and don't think that they don't think if I go and I decide to just eat maaser, it's not a problem, right? Again, it's given to the levi, but if he wants to entertain at his house and give me his maaser, I can eat it. Rabbanan, ma truma tovelet, af maaser rishon nami tovel. So what does he do with this juxtaposition in the verse? He says it's teach you a different halakha. Tevel is what we call produce that you haven't taken the truma to maaser yet from it. And if you eat that, you also are liable to the death penalty. This is different. This is, before it was truma if you're not a kohen. Here it's just produce that you haven't yet separated your tithes from. So they say, just like if you haven't separated the truma, remember I told you, first you do truma, then maaser rishon, then maaser sheni, or maaser ani. So what this is going to tell you is just like if you haven't taken truma, it's tevel, your produce. So I have my field, I gathered all my crops, and I decide to eat it before I take truma, liable the death penalty for that. Well, not only that, but even if I took my truma, but I didn't take maaser, af maaser rishon nami tovel. So let's say I took my truma aside, but I stopped there. it's still liable for the death penalty. That's why it calls maaser truma. To teach you, also maaser rishon is tovel, uchi detanya, and as it says in the braita, and we're going to see it's not only maaser rishon, it's even maaser sheni or ani. And we're now going to bring a braita to prove this point. It's a little bit of a problem with this braita. Right now, we said, the rabbis, the whole question was, what do they do with that hekesh in the pasuk, the juxtaposition of maaser and truma? So we said they use it to learn this halacha, that truma, that also maaser causes your produce to be tevel if you haven't separated it yet. Now, the Gemara is going to prove this by showing Rabbi Yossi holds the same thing. But the difficulty is going to be that Rabbi Yossi learned it from somewhere else. And we're trying to say the rabbis, what did they do with the hekesh? They used it for this halacha. And they're going to quote this braita seemingly to prove it. Well, they're proving the halacha, but they're bringing it from a different source, which is going to raise the question, well, then why do we need to use the hekesh to teach it when Rabbi Yossi had a different verse? So first, we don't think we're coming up to a question, but I'm already telling you there's going to be a question from this. And as it appears in the braita, Rabbi Yossi says, you might think that you're only liable if you have produce that you haven't separated anything yet from. But what if you only took truma and you didn't take maaser rishon, or maaser rishon v'lo maaser sheni, or you took the first tithe that goes to the levi, but you didn't take the second one, which you're supposed to eat in Jerusalem, or afilu maaser ani, or you didn't take the maaser that goes to the poor person, which is again, it's the same as maaser sheni. It's just taken in, it's the second maaser, but in the years 3 and 6 of the Shemitah cycle, as opposed to years 1, 2, 4, and 5, where you take maaser sheni. Minayin. So how do we know that you're liable also for those? Now you would expect him to bring this hekesh from the pasuk, but no. They learn it. Talmud lomar lo tuchal le'echol b'sha'arecha. You can't eat in your own gates. Maaser degancha tiroshcha v'yitzarecha. You can't eat the maaser in your gates. It says. Further on, it says when the levi gets the maaser, he can eat it in his gates and be satiated. Okay, actually, that's talking about the maaser ani. Okay, when you give to the poor people, he can eat in his gates and be satiated from it. Meaning, the purpose of it is to give the poor person sustenance. So, masha arecha hamor lahala maaser ani, just like there, achlu b'sha'arecha is referring to maaser ani. Af sha'arecha hamor kam, when it says you can't eat in your gates, must be referring also to maaser ani, right? Even to the least of importance, the maaser ani. Why is it least important? Well, because the kohanim and leviim, they treat that as more significant than maaser ani. There's less sanctity to the whole thing of maaser ani, even though obviously it's super important. The amarachmana lo tuchal, and what does the pasuk say? You can't eat it. Right? That means basically what they're saying, that pasuk lo tuchal le'echol b'sha'arecha means if you didn't take the tithes yet, you cannot eat your own produce. Okay? You can't eat it until you separate all the tithes. And because it says b'sha'arecha, and b'sha'arecha appears by maaser ani, it means even the maaser ani tithe must be taken. So now they say, okay, well, again, we brought Rabbi Yossi to prove this halacha that we just said the rabbis must learn from the hekesh. Again, the real halacha the rabbis that we were dealing with is that a stranger can eat maaser if they want. A non-levite can eat maaser. But what did they learn from that hekesh? There was Rabbi Meir's proof that a stranger can't eat, just like they can't eat truma, they also can't eat maaser. Well, rabbis took that juxtaposition to teach that you can't eat your produce before you took something totally different. Just like Rabbi Yossi says. But Rabbi Yossi had a different pasuk. So why do we need this pasuk when we already have Rabbi Yossi's pasuk about the lo tuchal le'echol b'sha'arecha? So, if you had learned it just from lo tuchal le'echol b'sha'arecha, you can't eat, what would you have thought? Hav amina lelav. You would have thought it's a lo tase. It's a regular negative commandment. Usually, what is it punishable by? Lashes. But aval mita lo, you wouldn't get the death penalty. Death, again, nobody's going to kill you in court for this, but you are liable death by the hands of God. So, kamash malan, that's why you needed the juxtaposition of truma and maaser in that verse. The Rabbi Meir learned from it something else. The rabbis say they're juxtaposed to teach you that you're going to be liable for maaser, just like you're liable for truma, meaning if you haven't separated maaser from your produce and you eat your produce before separating it, you're going to be liable the death penalty. Okay, which is different than if you eat maaser, then you won't be liable the death penalty. A stranger who eats truma, maaser, we already said, is not liable for the death penalty. But if you, right, that's once it's separated and given to the levi, you won't get the death penalty, even though it's forbidden according to Rabbi Meir. But someone who eats tevel, untithed produce, is going to get the death penalty. Now, even if you took truma, but you didn't take maaser, that's all the first way of reading the sugya. Now we're going to have a very shorter version of, also because they cut out the parts that you already know, but of how the sugya went about, that instead of saying, here's how the rabbis learned it, and then let's prove it with Rabbi Yossi, and then, oh, wait, but there's some duplication here because it's the same two verses to teach the same thing. How do we resolve it that way? Well, this version is going to start a little differently. Lishana Acharina, a different way of reading it, was maaser rishon de tavo mid Rabbi Yossi nafka. First, they learned, how do you know that produce that you haven't separated truma and maaser is going to be forbidden? We learned from Rabbi Yossi. And then they said, well, if from there we would have thought just lav mita lo, kamash malan, and therefore they brought the second verse, which was this juxtaposition between the hekesh, between maaser and truma, and that's how we learn it. So it's the same conclusion, it's just a little bit of a different order. Now we have to go back to our Mishnah and resolve a really big problem though. So until now, we basically, again, we got sidetracked with the verses, but what we basically said is the Mishnah is according to Rabbi Meir, who says a non-levi can't eat maaser. Well, b'mayu kimta ki Rabbi Meir, you're going to say it's Rabbi Meir. Well, something doesn't make sense here. Ema seifa, according to the end of the Mishnah, bat levi, this is the question we raised in the beginning. Me'ureset lekohen, a bat levi is engaged to a kohen, ubat kohen the levi, or bat kohen is engaged to a levi, or pregnant from, or shomer yabam, lo tochal lo b'truma v'lo b'maaser. Now that's very strange. Hi ma'izarut ikat. First of all, right, if she's a bat levi and she's betrothed to a kohen, if kohen can eat maaser, she can eat maaser, right? She's either a levi or a kohen. What's the difference? Why can't she eat maaser? So we're going to have two different explanations of the Mishnah. We're going to basically say the simple reading of the Mishnah, which says lo tochal lo b'truma lo b'maaser, isn't actually true. Okay, and it really means something else. So Rav Sheshet and Marbarei de Ravna are each going to have a different way of rereading this Mishnah, because otherwise, really, the Mishnah doesn't work. Amar Rav Sheshet, my ena ochelet katane. What does it mean, ena ochelet? It doesn't mean she can't eat. Of course, she can eat maaser, but ena notenet reshut litrom. I told you that when you get maaser, you have to take truma from it. If you're a levi, you have to take truma. So let's say she's a bat kohen who's married, or she's a bat, right, levi who's betrothed to a kohen. No, she would have to be a bat kohen betrothed to a levi. And comes in the maaser. She can eat it, no problem. But is she allowed, what this Mishnah is saying is she's allowed to eat it, but she can't send a messenger, like appoint somebody to separate the truma maaser, the part that has to go to the kohen. She can't designate someone to do that. That she doesn't have rights to. To which the Gemara says, wait a minute. Michlal de Nisua no tenet reshut. You're saying once she's married, though, fully married, she can give permission? So they say, yeah, in fact, she can. Okay, in other words, this is her husband's produce. But once she's married, she has rights to separate the truma. When she's not married and only betrothed to him, or shomer yabam to him, she doesn't have rights to do it. So how do we know this? The Hatanya, it says in a braita, Va'achaltem oto b'chol makom, the levi gets his maaser. He says, you can eat it b'chol makom, atem ubeitchem. You can eat it anywhere you want, you and your household. Now, beitchem usually means wife. Limed al nisua bat Yisrael shenotenet reshut litrom. From here, you learn that she is allowed to, she's just like her husband in the sense, now, even though this is not what the pasuk is talking about, in a minute we'll get to this, in the sense that she can separate the truma or appoint someone to separate the truma, no problem. Okay, well, I'm not sure of your question, Adina, but in general, people can appoint shlichim to do things. The point here, it seems to be, is not just that she can't appoint a shaliach, but she can't do it herself. It's not something she can do when she's betrothed. She can't separate the truma. But once she's married, she can. And we learn it from this pasuk that you can eat it anywhere you want, you and your household. How do we learn it from this pasuk? So they're going to ask, Ataomel, in this braita, they ask, Ataomel, reshut the truma, inu ele lechol. Like the simple issue is you can eat it, right? You can eat it just like your husband. It says, Va'achaltem oto b'chol makom. You can eat your maaser anywhere you are, you and your household. Wouldn't you think it just means the wife can eat? Who's to say she can separate it? So, Amarta, truma chamura ochelet maaser akal koshken. You don't need a verse to say that the wife of a Levi can eat maaser, because truma is obviously more strict than maaser. And there already we know, it says in the Torah, all his household, remember all the psukim about Yilid Beito and all that, everyone in his household can eat truma, including his wife. So if by the pasuk already says by truma the wife can eat it, you wouldn't need a pasuk by this to tell you that the wife of a Levi can eat maaser. And therefore, since it's not coming to teach about eating maaser, it must be coming to say she's just like him when it comes to also separating. When I see people are right, they separated in their house, right? Obviously, it makes sense that the woman could also be separating the produce. So now, right, okay, this is where we learn that if she's married, then she can give permission to separate the truma or obviously the maaser. So now, again, what did we say? When the Mishna says a bat kohen levi or a bat levi kohen can't eat truma or maaser, what it really means is if she's in this in-between stage, betrothed but not married, shomeret yabam but hasn't done yibum, or pregnant once her husband dies, she is allowed to eat maaser, okay, because she's either a bat levi or she's a bat kohen who's betrothed to a levi. But either which way, she can continue to eat maaser, not necessarily truma, depending on the situation, but she can eat maaser, but she cannot take the truma from the maaser. That right she only has when she's married fully. Okay, that was the first explanation. Again, this is clearly taking the Mishnah out of the pshat, okay, and likewise the next one, because the Mishnah simply says lo tochal lo b'truma v'lo b'maaser, okay, just to be clear. But it doesn't make any sense, and that's why they have to explain it, not according to the simple reading. He says, it means when it says she can't eat, not maaser, not truma, what it means is she can't go on the line to collect the maaser. Imagine it was like a collection station, right, where you would go to collect your maaser. There's all these laws about it. We'll get to them in other situations. Can an eved wait on the line? All different people, like, can you send your servant to, your Canaanite slave to go wait online for you? Can you send your wife to go wait online for you? So now so what they're saying is you can't send someone who's betrothed to you to go wait online to get the maaser. Okay, she's a bat kohen or a bat Yisrael, right? She's a bat kohen or she's a bat levi, mureset the kohen. You can't send her on the line. Now, this happens to be an issue that comes up. We're going to see it later in Yevamot. Comes up and says here, there's two reasons given. Now here, we're going to see soon that it's even a married woman can't do this. Then they're going to ask, well, then why does it say engaged woman? If this is what it's referring to, why does it say engaged woman? But even if she's married, the wife can't go on the line. Why not? So two possible reasons are given. So now they're going to mention both reasons and try to figure out how this works. So they say, Hani chalamad amar, this makes perfect sense according to the one who says, Mishum yichud. Well, we're worried you're going to go into the granary, and in there, it's just you and the person giving it out. And that's yichud. You're alone in a space with a man, and who knows what will happen. That's why don't send your wife, because it's Isur yichud. And that way, it would be the same issue here, okay? If you're betrothed to the man, so don't go be in a room alone with some other man. But the other option is that we're worried maybe you'll get divorced. And then what? Let's say you're a bat Yisrael and you get divorced. Now, you're married to a Levi or a kohen, and you go and collect the truma or the maaser for years, okay? You're married for many years. Okay, I'm going to compare this to, you're a member of a gym, and you go to the gym every day for 10 years. And then you decide one year, I'm not really, I can't afford it anymore. You stop going to the gym, okay? You stop your membership. You discontinue. Now, when you show up the next day after you've discontinued your membership, and the guard at the front there doesn't know that you've discontinued your membership, right? They'll assume, maybe you need a chip to get in. You'll say, oh, I left my chip at home. They'll assume that you're a member there because they know you for 10 years. They see you every single day. They're not going to know that you discontinued your membership. They don't keep like a wanted list, in the front there, all the people who stopped their membership. So therefore, it's the same thing here. If you wait online because you're married to the kohen or the levi, and then one day you might get divorced and the person giving out will have no idea, or the people on the line won't know, and you'll basically keep on collecting. So there's a concern for that. Now, in this case, in the Mishnah, there's no concern for that because she's a bat Levi anyway. So, right, or if she's a bat kohen married to a Levi, right, or betrothed to a Levi. So what will happen? If she gets divorced, she still can get maaser because she's a bat Levi, so, or a bat kohen. So it doesn't matter, right? So if that's the issue here, Grusha bat Levi, milo achla b'maaser. If she's the daughter of a Levi, she could still collect maaser. So why are we telling her you can't? So then they say, well, what are you talking about? Grusha bat kohen, milo achla b'truma. And that's in general then, let's say a bat kohen is married to a kohen, she should be allowed to collect truma, but we don't allow it. We don't allow any wives to collect. So why not? Ezra mishum grusha bat Yisrael. They just made an overall gzera and said, no wives can ever collect, even though it's not always applicable in every single situation. So in the end, that's the reason. Okay, so she can't, the Mishnah really means, according to Farber, she can't collect at the granary, not the truma, not the maaser, either because of yichud or because of the grusha issue. And even though this might not particularly apply to her, but it's part of the overall gzera that they instituted. But now comes the big problem. Even a married woman can't collect. So why did the Mishnah specifically bring an example of a betrothed woman or the me'uberet or all those cases we saw? So they just say, I did tani resha me'ureset, tani nami sefa me'ureset. Because the first two parts of the Mishnah, we're talking about those cases, they just continued the language. Okay, again, this is a very hard way to understand the Mishnah. Very hard to really say that this is the simple reading of the Mishnah. But again, the simple reading of the Mishnah also makes no sense. So the rabbis have liberty to kind of stretch it and pull it and try to make it fit to something that makes sense to them. So again, two options. We want to summarize what we've done so far. As we've said, the Mishnah is like Rabbi Meir, who holds that a non-levi can't eat maaser, even though not everyone agrees with this, and it's not the mainstream position. And number two, what does this Mishnah mean? The last part of the Mishnah, either it means like Rav Sheshet said, it means she doesn't have the power at this point when she's only betrothed or pregnant or whatever it is. She doesn't have the power to send a messenger or even herself to separate the truma from the maaser, or it means that she can't go to the granary to collect it. And that would apply even to a married woman as well. Tanu Rabana. Now we're going to go back, and some people think this is the exact same machloka between Rabbi Meir and the rabbis that we saw before, even though we kind of took Rabbi Meir to talk about the zal. Really what he said was, who gets what? The kohen, the truma goes to the kohen, the maaser rishon goes to the levi, and Rabbi Elazar and Azaria came and said, no, you can even give the maaser rishon to the kohen. So some people think this is the same machloka between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Elazar and Azaria. Some people try to explain it's a little bit different, but I'm not going to get into the details of that. But in the meantime, let's just learn this braita. Tanu Rabbanit. Truma lekohen maaser rishon levi. Okay, the truma goes to the kohen, the maaser rishon goes to the levi. Derive Rabbi Akiva. These are the exact words Rabbi Meir used, even though we really tried to push Rabbi Meir into saying it really has to do with kind of non-levi truma. Here, Rabbi Akiva seems clearly to be talking about who gets it. Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria Omer, turning out I'm a bet, lekohen. It only goes to the kohen. So they say, what do you mean? The kohen below the levi? What are you talking about? Maaser goes to the kohen, it doesn't go to the levi? It makes no sense. Ema af lekohen. No, what he means is exactly as we understood before. You can give it theoretically if you want to the kohen. Okay, so if you're separating your truma to maaser, you can decide to give your truma and your maaser to the kohen. And Rabbi Akiva says, no way, no how. Only to the levi. The kohen gets his truma, right? It makes sense, right? It's unfair. If you're going to give everything to the kohen, what's the levi going to end up with? My time is Rabbi Akiva. So where does he get it from? Dichtiv ve'el haleviim tidaber va'amarta alehem. Speak to the leviim and tell them. And then it starts saying, okay, so obviously the leviim kamishtai. The pasuk is talking about leviim. It goes to the levites, okay? And it says you get the maaser, you can eat them wherever you want, etc. That's to the levites. Ve'idach, well, the other opinion, Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria, where does he get it from? Kid Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. As Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says, Da'ama Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, there's 24 places where you see that kohanim are called levites. Because remember, kohanim came from Shevet Levi. And here's a proof, which is very strange proof because they're quoting it from Yechezkel, you expect in the Torah, ha-kohanim ha-leviim b'nei tzadok. The kohanim who are leviim, who are the sons of tzadok. Okay, that's what it calls them. So here you see, kohanim are called levites. Therefore, anytime it says levites in the Torah, it refers also to kohanim. And that's why the kohanim can get it as well. For Rabbi Akiva, hachalo matziram. Rabbi Akiva comes up with a creative explanation, as he's going to also come up with a creative solution to a problem later. Rabbi Akiva says you can't say that. Dichtiv. There's no way this pasuk could refer to kohanim. And like I said, it's a bit of a creative explanation. Dichtiv. V'achaltem oto b'chol makom. We saw this before, right? Atemu beitchen. You can eat your maaser any place you want. Okay, that means you give, right? The maaser gets, the levi gets the maaser. He can eat it anywhere he wants. How does he get from here? Well, it's misha yachol ochlo b'chol makom. This can only be referring to someone who can eat the maaser anywhere in the world. Yatsa kohen she'en yachol ochlo bebeit hakvarot. There's a certain places in the world, any cemetery, where a kohen can't eat the maaser. Why not? Because he's not allowed to go into a cemetery. So there's places in the world where the maaser can't be eaten by the kohen. This is why I say it's creative. So when it says you can eat it any place, it's only someone who can actually eat it any place. If the maaser happened to be in a cemetery, a kohen would not be able to access that food and eat it there because he can't go in there. Therefore, kohen is not included in that verse. That's how Rabbi Akiva gets him out of the verse. V'idach. So what does Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria do with that verse? He obviously doesn't explain it in that way. You can eat it anywhere you want, meaning you don't need the walled city of Jerusalem, for example, like maaser sheni. The second type has to be brought and only eaten in the walls of Jerusalem. So what it's telling you is you don't need to specifically eat your maaser in the walls of Jerusalem. You can eat it anywhere you want. It doesn't mean if you can't eat it every single place in the world, like in a cemetery, you can't eat maaser. No, right? This is a more simple explanation of it. And it also is teaching you another thing, which is if you eat it when you're impure, lo lake, you don't get lashes. Okay, you won't get lashes for eating it in an impure state, as opposed to truma, which you're going to get punished if you eat it in an impure state. You're not allowed to eat truma when you're tamei. Now we get to a story with Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria. Remember, Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria was a kohen, and he held kohanim can collect maaser, and Rabbi Akiva said kohanim can't collect maaser. So ahu ginta, it was a garden. To have a shakil Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria maaser rishon mineh. Because the owner would leave out maaser rishon, label it maaser rishon. People would come in and take. So Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria would go in and take it. Now it's a little bit strange because he was wealthy, as I told you. So it's a little weird that he'd be collecting the maaser, and he's a kohen. But he thinks a levi can take the maaser, so he would go collect. Rabbi Akiva, he went ahead. Okay, we already talked about kohanim not being able to go into cemeteries. Well, apparently one side of the field or the garden was a cemetery. So what did he do? He made sure he closed off the entrance that was not by the cemetery, and he opened only the entrance to this garden through the cemetery so that there was no way that Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria would be able to go in there and collect the maaser. Okay, basically he was trying to make a public display of you cannot do what you're doing. So what was Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria's reaction? And here we have many varying explanations because it's not a very clear statement. Some think that he said, wow, you're very smart. And some think he was putting him down. Amal Akiva b'tarmilo va'ana chaya. Okay, Akiva with his satchel, and I am alive. What on earth does this mean? Some people say, you have a satchel like you used to be a shepherd, not a Talmid Chacham. Remember, Rabbi Akiva only started learning at age 40. So, go back to your satchel, right? Shepherds were always considered non-learned people. And I'm the one alive, meaning, you're a lowlife. Alternatively, he could be saying, oh, you have a satchel full of a lot of things. Like you're very smart, you're full. And I'm alive? Like I'm a nobody. Okay, meaning you were really smart what you came up with, this tactic to make sure I didn't get the maaser. Okay, so it's a very unclear reaction, many different interpretations. There's even more to say about how Rabbi Akiva has a different way of learning than he does, where I kind of go by my tradition and he collects different opinions, right? Like collecting things in your satchel, like you go to the store and you go to this store, you go to that store and you put everything in your satchel. All different kinds of creative explanations here about what's going on, but unfortunately, we don't really know what the actual conclusion of the story was. Was he impressed with him or was he annoyed with him? Itma. Now, we'll get back to the story soon, but right now, Itma. It was said. Okay, there's a machloket tanaim here about machloket and amoraim. Itma is usually an intro to a debate between amoraim. Mipnei ma kadsu leviim b'maaser. Now we're going to find out that historically, Levim were penalized that they couldn't collect maaser anymore, which might explain why Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria was collecting the maaser. Rabbi Yonatan and the elders were debating this. Chadamar, one of them said, because they didn't go back to Israel in the Babylonian return to Israel, right from Babylonia, they didn't go back to Israel. We'll see in a minute or a few minutes where we get this from, how we know. Well, the problem is the kohanim become tamei a lot, and then they can't eat truma, so they need something to eat, so we give them maaser instead. And that's why we penalized the Levim. To which the Gemara is going to ask, wait, something doesn't jive here. It was said, why did we penalize the Levim? If we said they did something wrong, like they didn't come back to Israel, well, we get it. That's why they're penalized. But the kohanim would have what to eat. Mishum kohanim kansinu Levim. What about the Leviim? It's not fair to the Leviim. So, ela kule alma kanasa shelo alu b'yimei Bavel. Everybody obviously thinks that they were penalized because they didn't go up in the time of Ezra to Israel. But the question is, what's the debate here? Mar savar kanasa la'aniyim. The question is, once they penalize the Levites, then who gets it instead of them? So one said the poor people get it, okay, which makes sense, right? Umar savar, because kohanim have their own truma. Umar savar, kohanim v'imei trumatam aniyim ninhu. Some say, no, the kohanim, when they're, everyone thinks it goes to poor. The question is, do we call kohanim who are impure, poor people? And then we can give them to the poor, okay? So now they say, okay, in that case, if you say then, because remember, Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria are after the time when they've already penalized the Levim. The Levim don't get it anymore. So why did he close the entranceway to Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria? So if you say the kanas goes to aniyim, then it makes perfect sense. But right, what we're basically trying to do is reconcile this machloket with the story of Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria. But right? So he said, then why did he move the entranceway into a cemetery and prevent Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria if by law it goes to the kohanim? So this is what he said to him. If you want to get it because you claim that the Levites were penalized and now it goes to the kohanim, I get it, you can have it. But if it's because you're holding by your original opinion that in general maaser can go to kohanim, then you can't get it. Also, obviously, and I see someone wrote this in the chat, but obviously, as I mentioned this before specifically, so you would know this, which is he was wealthy. And also, it seems like even if he was wealthy, then he shouldn't be getting this because it should go to poor kohanim or people, right, who have issues. I mean, again, you could say maybe it's tamei and that's why, but still, he was wealthy independently. It's not like he needed the truma either, it sounds like. So in any case, he tries to prevent him from going for either which reason. How do we know they didn't go in the time of Ezra? It says in Ezra, I gathered all the people and we were there for 3 days. We camped there. And I got to understand them, or I taught them. But I didn't find anyone from Shevet Levi. Okay, so here you see Shevet Levi didn't come. Another thing about the Levites, originally, and actually it's not originally the shotrim really weren't from the levites, but at a certain point in history it became the Levites were the shotrim, the policemen, as it says in the following verse, which I will say is not actually a verse, and the commentaries try to figure out where they get this from. I'm not going to go into the details, but sometimes they quote a pasuk which actually isn't a pasuk. Either there was a mistake in the transmission, or maybe they were quoting from Ben Sira, or maybe they were paraphrasing some other verse. Anyway, it says, Shotrim harabim, there were many of them, meaning not from Shevet Levi, but from the majority of the people who stood at their head. Shotrim, by the way, policeman isn't like our modern day policeman. It's also like a judge kind of thing. Anyway, okay. Now we're going to finish with this last Mishna, and maybe we'll even read the whole Mishna if we have time, even though it goes to tomorrow's daf. I'm just going to pull up the presentation. Okay. new Mishnah, and now we're going to start with, okay. So here's our Mishnah. Bat Yisrael sheniseit lekohen tochal b'truma. Okay, we have a Bat Yisrael who's married to a kohen, she gets to eat truma. Okay, a lot of this should be somewhat reviewed, but it's a complicated case. Mate, if her husband dies, vilahi menu ben, and she has a son, because she's still connected to the kohen's family, tochal b'truma, she can continue eating truma. If after her first husband died, the kohen, she goes and marries a levi. Niseit levi tochal b'maaser. Now she can eat maaser, she can't eat truma anymore. Even though she has a son from the kohen, she's not allowed to eat truma because she married somebody else, and he doesn't allow her to eat truma, so she eats maaser. Mate, if he dies, okay, we're going to have a lot of death here. Okay, so sad story for this woman. Mate vilahi menu ben, and she has a son from the levi, the levite, tochal b'maaser. She can continue to eat maaser because she's connected with the family. But niseit Israel, if after both those husbands die, and she now marries a Yisrael, at this point, lo tochal lo b'truma v'lo b'maaser. Okay, she can't eat truma or maaser, even though she has sons from both men. She is now married to a Yisrael and connected to his house, can't eat anymore. Mate, if he dies, okay, so she's now 0 for 3, v'lahi menu ben, and she has a son with him, she's still connected to his family, and therefore lo tochal lo b'truma v'lo b'maaser. Okay, it goes by the most distance, right? As long as she has a son from the Israelite, she can't eat at all. What if, now we're going to go in the reverse, her sons start dying out in reverse order. So mate benami Yisrael, I told you, Nebuch woman, okay, everyone's dying on her, but again, it's a very theoretical case. Mate benami Yisrael, if her Israelite son dies, then what is she left with? Well, her worst case scenario is she has a Levi son, she's connected with the Levi's family, so she can eat maaser. Mate benami Levi, if he dies, tochal b'truma, she can now eat truma. Mate benami kohen, but if the kohen's son dies, then she goes back to being a regular Bat Yisrael, lo tochal, lo b'truma, v'lo b'maaser. And that takes us to the end of today's daf. We'll continue on though and just finish till the end of the Mishnah. Bat kohen sheniseit Yisrael. If she's a bat kohen, it's now the flip case. She can eat at home, but now all of a sudden she marries the Yisrael, she can't eat truma anymore. Lo tochal b'truma, mate, if he dies, vilahi menu ben, and she has a son, she's still connected with the Yisrael family, she can't go back home. If niseit levi, she now marries a levi, tochal b'maaser, because on account of her husband. Mate, if he dies, but lahi menu ben, but she has a son with him, she continues tochal b'maaser, continues to eat maaser. Niseit lekohen, if she marries a kohen now after he dies, right? Both husbands are dead. Now she goes and marries a kohen. Obviously, now she can eat truma. Mate b'lahi menu ben, if she still has a son from him, then tochal b'truma, she can continue to eat truma. But what if, again, in reverse order, mate benami kohen, the kohen's son dies, then she has to stop eating truma, lo tochal b'truma, because she still has sons from the Levite and the Israelite, the Israeli. Mate benami Levi, if her Levi's son dies, right? So then she can still eat maaser, but if her son dies from the Levi, then lo tochal b'maaser, she can't eat maaser anymore. But mate benami Yisrael chozeret lebeit avia. If her son from Yisrael dies, then since she's a bat kohen, she can go back to her father's house. And as the Mishnah ends, says Ba'al zone emal v'shava el beit avia kinu ureha milechem avia tochel. She can go back to her father's house as she was in her youth, and she can eat from the bread of her father. That's what the verse says, and that's why this woman, after her terrible tragedies throughout her life, she now is allowed to go back to her husband. Again, they don't view this when they write this Mishnah as tragedy, tragedy, tragedy. This is purely a theoretical situation, just trying to get you to think about not poor woman's life, but to think about exactly what allows you to eat truma and what doesn't, and what permits you to eat maaser and what doesn't, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, it's a sad story, but it's really not a sad story because it's really not a story at all. It's really just trying to get at the ins and outs of the halacha and make sure you get them straight, right? This chapter in general is about reviewing. So this is like a good review thing where it gives you this crazy case in order to understand all the concepts. With that, we'll finish for today and have a great day, everyone.